If I were to ask you, when you think of a situation that got bitter, historically, what's the first situation or people involved that you can think of? That's it. Hatfields and the McCoys. You remember that? I mean, that situation lives into legend. Do you know about what time that happened? It was a long time ago, 1878 to 1890. And it was a 12-year battle between the Hatfields of West Virginia and the McCoys of Kentucky. They lived on opposite sides of the river. Now, do you remember what sparked that feud? The first thing that sparked it was Asa McCoy of the Union Army was killed by the Confederate Home Guards on his way home after he'd been discharged from the service. And the Confederate Home Guards contained the Hatfields. So that kind of sparked the angst between them. But the more well-known part of what set that feud to become so bitter was the ownership of a hog. The dispute over who owned a hog that got in the middle of the river. 12 years that feud went on, and it cost 12 lives. 12 lives. So today we're going to talk about the elephant in the room of bitterness. Now the thing of it is, every one of us experiences bitterness at some point. Maybe we're bitter at God about a tragedy that happened and we don't understand the why. Maybe we're bitter with others. Maybe we're bitter with a boss who said, "We're terminating your position." Maybe we're bitter with a spouse who decided that there was greener grass somewhere else, or a parent who didn't treat us well, or a friend who betrayed us. Or maybe we're bitter with the church because somebody said something that hurt us or offended us. So how do you define bitterness? Well, if I had to define it, I would say that bitterness is harbored hurt hidden in our heart. Harbored hurt hidden in our heart. And if we allow it to fester, it can easily become deadly. Bitterness may not cause us to get into a feud like the Hatfield and McCoys, but bitterness can cause us to sabotage our own life. So how do we deal with bitterness? I've got some suggestions this morning, but this is not an exhaustive list. The first thing is we have to deal with the source of our bitterness. The scripture that Cindy read for us talked about the root of bitterness. And a root typically is something that hides beneath the surface and is invisible to the eye, but it stretches deep into the soil. How many of you get dandelions in your yard? How do you get rid of them? You don't get rid of them, do you? It's hard to get rid of them completely unless you resort to chemicals. Yeah. Dandelions, they take little cultivation and they're difficult to weed out. That's bitterness as well. So we need to understand why we're bitter. And typically it is either something that is done to us, something that is said about us, or something that is taken from us. Typically those things. Now, if you've ever been in a situation where someone has ever said anything about you that is slanderous or hurtful or untrue, you've been tempted toward bitterness, and you're in good company. Even Jesus talked about it in the Beatitudes. Blessed are you when people say evil against you. And what was Jesus' solution to that? Start the gossip chain? No. Don't start the gossip chain. We can become bitter when we've had wrong done to us. Wrong done to us. Jesus talked about that too. Turn the other cheek. I don't want to do that, Jesus. That's not fair. Someone messed with me and I want to mess with them back. But Jesus says no, because it's more important to God how we react to the wrongs done us than that we seek revenge. Or how about the things taken from us? Taken from us. Boy, we've been praying lately about a lot of deaths. It's been a cycle of that recently, and sometimes we will go a month or two without having to pray for a family who's lost a loved one. But it can be really hard not to get caught up in a cycle of bitterness when we've lost someone and we think they didn't deserve what they got. We need to deal with, when we're tempted to be bitter, we need to deal with the course of that bitterness, how we handle it. Because if we nurture our bitterness, if we dwell on it, it's going to dominate us. How many of you have ever seen kudzu? Where do you see it? Yeah, if you're driving south, down into Kentucky and south of there, all of those hills. Why was kudzu deliberately planted? Yeah, erosion control. And guess what? It works for erosion control, but it kills everything else. Yeah. And bitterness is like kudzu. It takes over, and you can't get rid of it with an atomic bomb. So bitterness, it will absorb us like a sponge. And it will become like a magnet, because our minds and our hearts will go back to what obsessively we're bitter about. We'll just revisit it, and it becomes a reel that plays in our mind. And the moment that we start hating a person or hating a situation, we become a slave to that person or that situation, because that starts to control our thoughts. Did you know that resentment and bitterness can kill you? I could invite Dr. Chamberlain up here and he could give a lot of testimony, I'm sure. But resentments and bitterness cause stress hormones to relieve. And all those stress hormones mess with our bodies. We can become fatigued and not be able to sleep. Bitterness is a depressant. You know any happy, bitter people? Have you known bitter people? Are they rays of sunshine? I've never encountered a bitter person who's a ray of sunshine. If we find ourselves consumed with criticism, cynicism, negativism, pessimism, all those isms, we might ask ourselves what we're bitter about. Because then we find ourselves not functioning normally. I found a quote as I was prepping for this sermon, and it says this: someone once said that carrying a grudge is like being stung to death by one bee. We dwell on that one thing, and we let it kill us. And it's going to physically debilitate us. Do you know that there are more than 50 diseases, starting with ulcers and high blood pressure, that can be attributed to stress and bitterness? Bitterness promises too much, and the price is too high. So we need to defeat the force of our bitterness, because it's like living with emotional toxins. What happens if our kidneys quit working? You die. Because what does our kidney do? Yeah, it drains all the bad stuff out. Bitterness is like having non-functioning kidneys. Yep. And bitterness and unforgiveness, which is tied to a lot of bitterness, is like drinking poison and waiting for it to kill somebody else. Drinking poison and waiting for it to kill someone we're upset or angry with. So how do you get rid of bitterness? The first thing you have to do is get rid of your desire for revenge. Now, I would say we should forget bitterness, but it's impossible to forget. But we need to bury it in an unmarked grave. You know, when I think of Bible characters who had reason to be bitter, I think of Joseph in the Old Testament. What happened to Joseph? His brothers thought he was the favored son, so they sold him into slavery. He ended up in prison. He got accused of making advances against Potiphar's wife. All of that happened to him, and he took each opportunity to rise above it. And he ended up being the second in command in Egypt. I'm a farm girl. Shared that with you before. And we used to go swimming in the creek that was near the family farm. There was one bad thing about that. The creek had leeches in it. Did you ever get a leech attached to you? It is nasty, let me tell you. And so let me share the protocol of finding a leech on your skin. Do you want to pull it off? That's your first instinct. But what happens if you pull a leech off? Part of it stays under your skin. That's right. And so there's a process for releasing leeches. And I'm not going to go into all of that, because that's not what the purpose of this is. However, the leech of bitterness can attach to our heart, and it's resentment under the surface. Now, friends, I got to tell you, I got to get a real moment this morning because I'm a little bitter this morning. And I'm not kidding you. I am so fed up with that wheelchair situation. I'm fed up with it. And I'm a little bit bitter about it. 4 stinking days for the next thing to break on the wheelchair. And when he was there last Monday to fix it, he said, "We've replaced everything on this wheelchair that can be replaced. You ought to be good for a while." 4 days. And my tendency, I'm here to tell you, friends, is I want to be bitter about it, Megan. Stinks. But I'm not the one sitting home in the wheelchair. And my husband, bless his heart, is not bitter. He's chosen to be better rather than bitter. Monica, I got one of the good ones. Because I don't know where he comes up with his strength once in a while. And I'll get over it. But right now, I'm bitter. And I want to be bitter. But I've got to remember that there are better choices than being bitter. And I've got to remember that Jesus had every right to be bitter. I mean, they nailed him to a cross, and he'd done nothing wrong. And he did it out of love for us. You know, the scripture that Cindy read for us kind of gave us the antidote to bitterness. Pursue peace. Take initiatives to end whatever war you're in, even if it's a war with yourself. Pull down your defenses, rebuild the bridges that you need to rebuild, restore broken relationships, even if you've been wronged. Because hell is a bitter place filled with bitter people. People who are bitter because they allowed their hurt to fester and it colored their overall approach to life. They listened to the wrong voices, they ran with the wrong crowd, they made the wrong decisions, and they served little gods. You know, Jesus died to deliver us from the sin of bitterness. And he was raised from the dead to free us from bondage. Now I'm going to say this twice because it's worth hearing. You can overcome what you've undergone by the grace and love of God. Let me say that again. You can overcome what you've undergone by the grace and love of God. We're going to be starting Lent pretty soon. And that's the season where we do some